WVW Broadcast Network and The New American are pleased to present The New American TV with your host, Rebecca Terrell. This broadcast is committed to helping you understand the truth behind the news. And now, here's your host, Rebecca Terrell.
Welcome to The New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Today is Monday, February 20th, and we have a special presentation today in honor of President's Day. The New American's Daniel Natal is here to discuss many of our unsung hero presidents with Steve Bias. Readers of our magazine will recognize both of their names. Daniel hosts his own program at thenewamerican.com, and Steve is a regular contributor. Steve is also a director of the history program at Randall University in Moore, Oklahoma, and author of History's Greatest Libels. His writings have appeared in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, the Chronicles of Oklahoma, and other periodicals. Let's join them now to discuss important presidents who led this country to greatness throughout history.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence proclaims God-given rights, and we intend to protect them. Working with people like you for over 50 years, preserving freedom and building a better tomorrow. Safeguarding the Constitution by limiting government power. We are restoring liberties, educating voters, and leading the freedom movement. Join with us. United, we will defend our rights. We are all Americans. We are the John Birch Society.
Sophia paused before the door. It read, Department of Bidigital Convergence. Just inside was a new world, a better world, the one of everlasting life, of no pain, of no loss, of no problem. She entered the chamber and her surroundings changed. She saw around her an infinite field of waving golden grain surmounted by cloudless blue sky. The AI voice whispered gently in her mind, Welcome to the singularity. She couldn't see it and couldn't feel it, but her body had almost instantly been covered by a swarm of tiny gray multi-legged bots that melted through her clothes and into her skin. Not perceiving the nightmare, her eyes had already been consumed and the rest of her body was dissolving as the bots digested her flesh. She felt only a warmth suffusing her being. Drowsy, she drifted to sleep, and her last thought was one of panic. Would she ever wake? Could a nightmare vision like this be an outcome of the much-hyped transhumanist technological singularity? Enter the world of the future as illuminated by the experience of the past in Endgame, the new book by Dennis Barrett, the publisher of The New American magazine, and find out how the disastrous COVID pandemic response fits with the technocratic elite's thirst to create a transhumanist utopia. Get Endgame from shopjbs.org with free shipping with code ENDSHIP, ENDSHIP. Or get Endgame and the Great Reset Collector's issue of The New American magazine and get free shipping plus an additional 20% off both with code END20, END20.
Welcome to The New American TV with Rebecca Terrell, and I am Daniel Natal here on this very special President's Day, and I'm happy to be chatting with Steve Bias of The New American as well. He's a phenomenal writer and has deep knowledge of and repositories of history, and so I'm here to kind of pick his brain, and we're going to walk through some of the presidents and see where that leads. And so to start off, Steve, I'm going to ask you some of your impressions on the nature of the presidency, just to start off. And I was reading Charles Beard, his History of the United States, and I think it was from 1920. And he was talking about how the founding fathers were at a loss to do federal governance because they had all done state governance. A lot of them had been governors and stuff. And so the British, the imperial system had taken care of the kind of what would be the federal layer. And so when the British left, we were still very competent at state and local, but we didn't know too much about, what is a president? What is he supposed to do? And for instance, John Adams wanted to be called His Majesty. And Ben Franklin's grandson, jokingly called him His Rotundity, and he immediately arrested him. And so they were working that through. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, it's interesting that the people at the Constitutional Convention one of the things that the reason they created the office of President of the United States was they wanted more than just like have a committee to carry out the laws and that sort of thing. Is they wanted a person in that office that could provide a check on the power of Congress, because they knew Congress would have a great amount of power under the Constitution, and so they did put that in there. And now, as it's turned out, our biggest problem now is that Congress defers too much to the President of the United States, far more than what the founders envisioned. We've almost made like a 4-year king out of the president.
Well, I noticed, like, okay, so basically there were tensions tearing, the republic apart because it was, 13 different little mini countries with 13 different constitutions. They had their own currencies at certain points, and so it was much more like the EU. And so this tendency toward regionalism was seen as a possible destructive agent, like an acidic agent eating into the republic. And so Henry Clay, back in the 1830s, he wanted to promote Americanism, which later would become federalism. So we were very consciously kind of trained not to be a Virginian, not to think of yourself as a New Yorker, but to think of yourself as an American. And this has become very, kind of central to how, people reflexively behave. But what it does is it gears us psychologically to think in terms of federal power. Like Americanism, one of the great things is it stabilized the society, but one of the bad things is it got us to stop paying attention to our local elections and to just pay attention to the federal elections, where you have vastly less power than in those local, so it kind of came with, good things and bad things. And that's, you saw the power shift from the states to the feds because of Henry Clay's, Americanism model. So.
Well, I think in a lot of cases, I think the founders thought that Congress would be jealous of their powers being taken by the president. And one of the there's a couple things I think that they didn't really foresee. They foresaw a lot of things, and they were very brilliant. But one thing was they didn't see that people would put their whoever's in office, if he's of their party, they let him get away with a whole lot more. If he's of the other party, oh, man, we're not going to do that, and all that sort of thing. And another thing is that if the president does it, they don't have to vote on it, and they don't have to answer to the voters. They can say, oh, the federal bureaucracy, the president, all this kind of stuff, and they can get away with it, unfortunately. And most of our presidents in this century, the last century, have been all too willing to take that power and expand it as far as they can expand it.
Yeah, our first president, just to start with George Washington, he was very skeptical and suspicious of political parties, and he didn't want us to bring over the tradition of political parties from England. And political parties are not in our Constitution. And I was just interested in some of the shallow reading that I've done, where they talk about how originally, like in the setup, it's supposed to be the Electoral College, which is, the states send delegates. They go to this, they convene and they decide on who's going to be president. And so it was this two-step methodology that the people vote for the state legislators send those electors, and the electors pick the president. So it's one step removed from kind of the mob. And that was a safeguard. But that power of the Electoral College was very quickly short-circuited by political parties. So originally, before 1826, if you wanted to be president, you'd have to make your case at the Electoral College. You'd have to convince them, the delegates from Vermont or the delegates from, Connecticut or whatever. And then after 1826, when the political parties gained an ascendancy, then the candidates were chosen by these political parties, which are just corporations owned by oligarchs, and they chose the candidates months before the Electoral College, and the Electoral College just became a stamp. And now that the people that check was removed, and presidents started seeing themselves not as, I'm part of the executive branch, you're part of the legislature. They started to say, I'm a Republican, you're a Republican. So that antagonistic relationship between a president and a congressman was erased, and that check was sabotaged. because now
Yeah.
they're letting, if it's his party, they're going to allow him to get away with whatever. We're seeing that right now with Biden and the Democrats, that are in the legislature.
Yeah, they're just in lockstep. But the original method now, the term electoral college does not actually appear in the Constitution. They talk a lot about electors, but not the electoral college. The electors never actually meet in one place. They would just meet in their state capital and they would cast their votes. And it was left up to the state, by the Constitution, the state legislature would decide the method of choosing presidential electors. And sometimes the legislature would just choose them themselves. Sometimes they would, put it up to popular vote, to choose the electors and that sort of thing. And as you say about political parties, they, when they first did it, whoever got the highest, you'd vote for two people on your ballot if you were a presidential elector. The guy who got the highest number of votes would be president, and whoever came in second would be vice president. And of course, then we get political parties, and of course Jefferson, and he started along with Madison and some others what they call the Republican Party, not the same as today's Republican Party, but the electors around the country that wanted the Republicans and the Jeffersonian Party to win, they'd vote for the same guy. I mean, they would all cast their votes for the presidential candidate of the party and the vice presidential candidate of the party. So when they tied in 1800, Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr, they realized they now had a problem. And so that's why we have the 12th Amendment. And just as an aside, the reason that the founders provided for amendments to the Constitution was for unforeseen circumstances like this that they had not anticipated. They didn't put amendment process to rein in the federal government, like the convention of the states people think that that's not why they did it. We already have something that is supposed to rein in federal officials, and that's the Constitution itself. If you add an amendment, what good is that going to do? If they don't follow the Constitution as it's written, who thinks they're going to follow an amendment if it were actually adopted?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that's kind of how the system kind of evolved, and so that's the way the political parties have messed up. That idea of political parties have messed up things to
Yeah.
that extent.
Yeah, like John Stuart Mill in Considerations on Representative Government, he says no matter how good your governmental apparatus is, it is worthless if you do not have a populace willing to enforce it. And he said it is like a horse that does not have a rider. So people who think, oh, well, the constitutional amendment, the Convention of States people, oh, we'll just put a constitutional amendment there. But if they're not enforcing what's there,
Yeah.
we have to have a totally different political culture. And part of that, I wanted to segue here. In preparation for this, I got some books, the Essential Book of Presidential Trivia and Presidential Anecdotes. And I haven't had time to read very deeply in them, but one of the things that I noticed in the Essential Book of Presidential Trivia was an interesting theme. I'm going to read, I've got some notes here just really quickly. And it's about presidential poverty. And so this is one of them. It says, Jefferson tried to sell his home in a lottery to pay all of his debts when he was 83 years old. Former President Madison was turned down for a loan by the Bank of the United States when he was desperate for money. Monroe was always broke and died penniless. Andrew Jackson left the White House with only $90 in his pocket and that was literally all he had. Ulysses S. Grant, of course, everybody knows. Mark Twain helped him write his autobiography because he was going to leave his widow destitute. And and this goes down even to Harry Truman, right? It says Harry Truman's financial situation contributed to the doubling of the presidential salary to $100,000 in 1949. And there's a list of, I went online, 5 poorest presidents, Chester A. Arthur, Wilson, Garfield, Coolidge, Truman. So a lot of these people, like Nixon, even up to Nixon, he said in his famous speech about, my wife might not have furs, but she's got like a cloth coat, like a proud Republican cloth coat.
Yeah.
And so all of these presidents, our culture was like Truman himself said it. He said, "You don't enter politics to get rich." He was like, "If you enter to get money, you're crooked. You know, the only people who get rich in politics are crooks." And so very until very recently in our presidential culture, I mean, they left and they went to very modest houses. Now we have Pelosi with 6 mansions, and like every Bernie Sanders with his fourth house, you know, and all of a sudden the political culture has changed in surprisingly recent memory. I wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, you know, in the 19th century, 1800s, it was almost like it was a great virtue to say how poor you could say you were, and it even led to the joke he should be president because he lives in a log cabin he built with his own hands, you know, and all this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
But like you say, even Reagan lived in a 1,600 square foot home
Mhm.
in his last years. So it's really, and of course George H.W. Bush was wealthy to begin with, but you know, starting I would say probably with the Clintons is when it really made a shift towards how wealthy they, you know, that they've become. But one thing I wanted to talk about was the very name of President's Day, if I could,
Yeah, but
is
absolutely.
that's a real, you know, that here again, I think that's kind of like making that office like a temporary king, you know, that we honor. We go through and I'll talk about the presidents of the United States, but it was originally George Washington's birthday. And so then, you know, they slipped Abraham Lincoln in there, and you know that so okay, we're going to honor both Washington and Lincoln, and so it's never been officially changed in law from George Washington's birthday, but it became popularly known under when Nixon was president as President's Day. And I would like to see us go back to just George Washington's birthday and do away with this whole thing about President's Day, because we honor George Washington not essentially just because he was president, but it's also his role as commander in chief of the Army, Continental Army. And, you know, had it not been, he's the reason it's called the father of our country, is there wouldn't be a United States without George Washington as we know it today. And he is the example that he gave. If you don't have anything else to say about George Washington, was right at the end of the war that he was basically offered the opportunity to be a military dictator. And he said, we didn't fight this war for 7 years to have such a type of government in this country. And he turned it down. And I think right there, that should have cemented him as the greatest hero in the history of the Republic. And so I think
That,
I would
yeah.
like to just go back to George Washington's birthday and forget this President's Day stuff, you know, and we can talk about presidents, but that's what I think it should be.
Yeah, no, I remember, I think it might have been Talleyrand in France, the diplomat Talleyrand, and he said, you know, he was watching America very closely, and he said, if George Washington steps down peacefully and there's a peaceful transition to power, he said he's one of the greatest men who ever lived, like Cincinnatus back in the Roman Empire, you know, returning to his farm, like after his power, he didn't cling on to it. And interestingly, just to circle back, Talleyrand helps us circle back to the Clintons and corruption in a sense. I was reading about John Adams's presidency, so the second president of the United States, John Adams, and there was something called the XYZ affair. And so French pirates were attacking American ships, and the Americans had to deal with this. And so they sent over, you know, some delegates to negotiate, and they were told by Talleyrand that we'll negotiate with you if you give me $50,000 and the or 50,000 pounds, excuse me. And so the Americans were infuriated at this level of casual corruption, but that was the way statecraft was done, through bribery and corruption. And what's interesting is that was the State Department. So when Hillary Clinton lost to Barack Obama, when it was kind of, you know, possibly through, you know, chicanery taken away from her and given to Mr. Obama, they placated her by giving her the State Department role. And it's just it's stunning that she did exactly what Talleyrand did. she would say, okay, well, we'll negotiate this soybean contract with you, Morocco, or we'll negotiate this cocoa contract with you, Nigeria, if you give a 50,000, pound loan, let's put it in those terms, to my Clinton Foundation. And it like, so statecraft had not really evolved that much since the days of Talleyrand.
Yeah, and that's as I say, that's kind of started with the Clintons. This whole thing about presidents getting so wealthy, from having been president. It's not like, you have a situation like a Franklin Roosevelt or George Bush or even, George Washington. They had money before they became president. But this idea that you become president of the United States and you become extremely super wealthy like the Clintons have become. And of course, you talk about corruption, and I agree about the Clintons and so forth. But I think the person that's occupying the office right now may be just about the most corrupt man who's ever sat in the Oval Office.
Yeah, he's doing exactly that, selling access. He's using the office to sell access, literally, and sabotaging his country like the Clintons did. There was a really good book by Marin Katusa. He's a Canadian energy policy expert, and he wrote a book called The Colder War, and it was about Hillary Clinton basically sabotaging, using green legislation to sabotage the United States' ability to harvest energy, to do energy production, to get uranium. And so, selling 3/4 of America's like uranium, like stockpiles to Russia, and then they give her a donation to the Clinton Foundation. So she's sabotaging her own country, to foreign interests. And so Biden did exactly that with Burisma and China. Like, he was getting kickbacks to basically hobble his own country's industry, and he was personally benefiting from it. And our political culture is such that we don't have the restraining influence that John Stuart Mill said. He said, no matter how good your constitution is, your governing apparatus, it's worthless if you do not have people, and I'll paraphrase here, with pitchforks and torches, kind of like coming after these people. And it's, we're right now in a crisis of corruption, so.
Well, John Randolph of Roanoke, who was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson, is a member of Congress, and he said very early on, he was concerned that we were deviating from the Constitution. we would be happy probably be back in that day, as far as that part of it. But he made the comment that the Constitution of the United States is just parchment. It's just a piece of paper unless we hold our elected representatives to it. And as far as presidents go, the 20th century has not been all that great as far as presidents. I would say that there have been 4 presidents in the 20th century that I would consider hardly any good at all, and 2 of them, the two best ones, I think, were in the early part of the 20th century. Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge.
I would have picked both of those. That's interesting.
Yeah, and
you made me feel smart. See?
Yeah, and I just think Harding. I've called him the most underrated president in American history, and it's because of the Teapot Dome scandal and that sort of thing. That when people hear about him, they associate him with the Teapot Dome scandal, which he had nothing to do with, other than he appointed the guy that was corrupt, and it turned out, and he didn't know, but he when he nominated him, he had Albert Fall was a member of the United States Senate, and there were no confirmation hearings, and the senators voted unanimously to confirm Albert Fall. So if we blame Warren Harding, shouldn't we blame every member of the United States Senate that voted to confirm him? But what I would say about Harding is I love his quote. In this quotation by him was a direct repudiation of the progressive era that had been for the first 2 decades leading up to him. He said that all human ills are not curable by legislation. And that was a direct repudiation of the whole progressive era. And then of course Calvin Coolidge, he comes in, and one of the quotes I like from him is that it's better to kill a bad bill than to pass a good one. So these are my two guys. These these are the two presidents of the 20th century I like the most.
It kind of reminds me of in the 19th century, with Grover Cleveland, who was the veto
Yes.
king, and he complained bitterly about all the jobism. Henry Adams said that, famously. He said that, bribery, the form of the bribery takes in Washington is jobs, right? So you get like a do nothing job, and you're making, six figures to, barely show up, if that. Pete Buttigieg, and there's no accountability, and you just, and so Grover Cleveland was famous for vetoing. I think he vetoed when he was the president. I think they said the anecdote was that he vetoed more than twice as many bills as all previous presidents combined. And so that caused like no end of like frustration with him in the political, his
Yeah.
horizons eventually, like dimmed because he wasn't into graft and corruption. And one of my favorites in the 19th century as well was Polk. Nobody
Yeah.
talks about
Right.
James K. Polk, and he added so much to the United States in terms of territory. This was a man who, like, he had 5 campaign promises, and he actually achieved all 5. He added almost as much land to the United States as the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson, right? So we got all the West, we got California, we got Oregon, and he did it all within a 4-year period. And after he did his 5 points, he was like, you know what? I'm going to retire. I'm not even going to go on to the, but he dies. But the point being is they're not taught in school, like these wonderful presidents. But who would, just to circle back to the 20th century, who would be your other two favorite presidents?
Other than Harding and Coolidge.
Yeah, correct.
Well, I think that Reagan and Trump did a lot of good things, but there's some things I could also be critical of them about as well. And other than that, it's a wasteland. I mean, who else? Do you have somebody besides those?
Yeah, like we picked the same ones. It's funny because this is kind of because we have very similar values, obviously.
Yes.
And yeah, so I'm trying to scrape my mind. I mean, my favorite let's go out of the 20th century. My favorite presidents would probably be, and you're probably going to attack me here, um, but I liked the way that Thomas Jefferson fought for the Republican idea. He was more of an Articles of Confederation republic, whereas the Federalists were more, they wanted to remake England inside the United States. So I do like his, for lack of a better word, his populism, his trust in the people. Let's see, who else do I like in the 19th century? Polk, obviously, as I just said. I'm just, I'm scrapey. You're right. I mean, most of them are non-entities. Most of them are political, which is actually what they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be a cult of personality. They're supposed to be functionaries, but they're supposed to be competent functionaries, And so if you get a competent functionary like Grover Cleveland, who our own Christian Gomez at the New American, he's a huge Grover Cleveland fan, and he gave me some books on Grover Cleveland. Yeah, I mean, you want a competent administrator, and that I think that was one of the troubling things about Donald Trump, and it still is going forward, is that, like, it was Trump's policies that I liked, like bringing jobs back to America, manufacturing, kind of like realizing that globalization, has made a more fragile system, and that we needed to be more independent. But then there are the people who go for like the cult of personality. They're the people, oh, he's rich, he's a success. And I think those people have been very disappointed in, kind of Trump's hijinks. And Trump himself, has kind of veered toward occasional flashes of narcissism where he'll be like, oh, they'll follow me wherever I go. And I think at one point he even said that his followers were so dedicated and loyal that he could shoot somebody in Times Square and they would still be, and at that point, like, you're like, this isn't supposed to be cult of personality. This be more Grover Cleveland.
Yeah, and I'll say this on Grover Cleveland. I liked he vetoed, as you were saying, bills. One was a bill to give some relief to some drought-stricken farmers in Texas, and he said he felt sorry, sympathetic to the farmers, but he said he could find no place in the Constitution of the United States where that would be authorized. And so, he kind of basically said that once we go down this road, there will be no end to it. And one of the things I like to say in my classes when I cover that, I just read his veto message, and then I slip in there and said, someday we'll be giving away free cell phones, and of course they kind of jerk up, and that sort of thing. But let me tell you just a little personal thing that he did. I have about 4 biographies of Grover Cleveland. He's one of my favorites, and after he was president.
Don't let the FBI know. They'll
No, you don't.
List you as a radical.
Yeah, after Cleveland was president, he got married later in life, and his wife was several years younger than him. So he was in his 60s when he had a couple of girls in grade school. You may have heard of Baby Ruth. That was a national sensation when she was born, and all that. But after Cleveland died, his widow Frances, she recalled that on Valentine's Day, we just had Valentine's Day, made me think about this, is that his 2 daughters were telling him about exchanging Valentines in school. That was something they were doing back then, and they said they felt sorry for this one girl because she didn't get a Valentine from anybody. And she said she looked over her husband, and he had his wife in tears away. And what he did is he wrote out a Valentine for this little girl and hired somebody to go take it over to her house. So this little girl got a Valentine from the former president of the United States, Grover Cleveland. I just thought that was really a neat story about him.
Yeah, that is a phenomenal story. And with that, because you circled back to Valentine's Day, which we just had in the present, and so that seems like a good place to end this kind of President's Day special edition. And I would encourage anybody to read any of these biographies that we've mentioned on any of these presidents, and to learn more obviously about the Constitution. Read the Constitution, but also read Steve Bias. Steve Bias has just phenomenal articles in thenewamerican.com, which you can find at thenewamerican.com. Go there, read Steve Bias. This guy is amazing, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on, Steve.
Well, thank you so much for having me with you today.
Awesome. And we'll see you after these commercials.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country's in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
All right, parents, listen up. We've all seen the countless examples of how radical leftists have been destroying American schools. It's no longer just about the terrible math and reading levels. Now, radical left teachers birthed from liberal universities are forcing gender indoctrination in kindergarten. They're teaching lessons on white guilt.
Freedom Project Academy has perfected live online learning over the course of a decade. I get a ton of great feedback about this program, a ton.
They're built on Judeo-Christian values, a classical curriculum. What does that mean? It means they're taught, your children are taught the way that the founding generations of the country. My own son Noah did Freedom Project Academy for several years when he was younger.
The more we tell our friends about these things, the more people will get on board, and I believe that we can be the catalyst to some real change.
We must save the West. Our way of life and our culture is under attack, and because of patriots like you and your project, I have optimism for the future.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we report the truth behind the news. Freedom Project Academy is an online homeschool organization that teaches the same classical curriculum that many of our founding fathers enjoyed. We now bring you some of their material as a showcase of what FPA students learn, making them proud of our national history.
Let me tell you a little story about a man named George Washington. Born in Virginia on February 22nd, 1732, he would become the only president to receive every electoral vote. A very tall man, Washington began his military career at 20 years old, joining up with the Virginia militia. At 26, he married Martha Custis and helped raise her 2 children. By his 40s, George was earning his stripes, commanding troops of the Continental Army to victory in the Revolutionary War. In 1789, he was chosen as America's first president. During that time, he helped create the first presidential cabinet system and national bank. Today, Washington's image can be seen on Mount Rushmore, the dollar bill, and quarter. He has his own monument, the tallest in D.C. America's national capital is named after him, as well as a state, the only one to be named after an American president. On December 14, 1799, while checking his farms in the freezing rain, George Washington developed pneumonia and died at the age of 67. And there you go, a little story about a man named George. Let me tell you a little story about a man named John Adams. Born in Massachusetts on October 30th, 1735, he would become one of the nation's first constitutional lawyers. Considered one of the most influential founding fathers, his first stint in politics was as a delegate in the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. At 28, he married Abigail Smith and together raised 6 children, including John Quincy, who would become the nation's 6th president. Through his years, he helped draft the Declaration of Independence and wrote the Massachusetts State Constitution. John was the first to nominate George Washington as Commander-in-Chief during the Revolutionary War and John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1789, he ran alongside George Washington, becoming America's first vice president. 8 years later, he was elected as the nation's 2nd president. In 1800, he lost his re-election to Thomas Jefferson and became one of 4 presidents in history not to attend his successor's inauguration. John Adams died on July 4, 1826, at the age of 90. Ironically, that day, Thomas Jefferson also passed, all while America celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And there you go, a little story about a man named John. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Thomas Jefferson. Born in Virginia on April 13, 1743, he would become the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. His family name and hard work prepared him to be one of America's most famous founding fathers. In addition to writing the Declaration, he was the first U.S. Secretary of State, the 2nd Vice President, and 3rd President. During his presidency, Jefferson brokered the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark Expedition, who would have been completely lost if not for their faithful GPS. Also known as Sacagawea. Tom co-founded one of the country's major political parties and is the only president to serve 2 terms without vetoing a single bill of Congress. He was an architect, inventor, lawyer, and founder of the University of Virginia, the only American university to be founded by a U.S. president. At 29, Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton and together raised 6 children. Today, Tom's image can be seen at the Jefferson Memorial, Mount Rushmore, $2 bill, and the nickel. Let's face it, we all know Franklin got the better deal in the money department. Ironically, Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, the same day as John Adams and the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And there you go, a little story about a man named Tom. Let me tell you a little story about a man named James Monroe. Born in Virginia on April 28, 1758, he would become the last founding father to serve as president. At 18, he dropped out of college to join the Continental Army, where he befriended George Washington. 4 years later, he went back to school to study law under Thomas Jefferson. At 27, James married Elizabeth Courtwright and together raised 3 children. Destined for a life in politics, he served in the Continental Congress, Senate, and as governor of Virginia. He was also Secretary of State and Secretary of War at the same time. In 1817, James Monroe was elected as the nation's 5th president, winning 80% of the vote. Sadly, he was also the last president to wear a powdered wig and knee breeches. Many say James is most famous for proclaiming the Monroe Doctrine, which said the U.S. wouldn't stand for any more European interference in Latin America. The capital city of the West African country of Liberia is also named after him, and he is featured in the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware. James died in New York on July 4, 1831, at the age of 73, becoming the third president to die on Independence Day. And there you go, a little story about a man named James. Let me tell you a little story about a man named John Quincy Adams. Born in Massachusetts on July 11, 1767, he would become the first president in history to have a father also serve as president. In 1788, he graduated from Harvard, pursuing a career in law. While working in England, Adams married Louisa Catherine Johnson and remains the only president to have a foreign-born First Lady. John served in the House of Representatives, Senate, and as Secretary of State. In 1824, during the presidential race, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. However, the Electoral College voted in favor of John. Enter the nation's sixth president, John Quincy Adams. Like his father, John only served one term. He and his father were two of three presidents who did not attend their successors' inaugurations. Adams is the only president to be elected into the House of Representatives after leaving office. In 1843, he became the first president to sit for a photograph. On February 21, 1848, during a heated session of Congress, Adams collapsed to the floor. 2 days later, at the age of 80, he died inside the speaker's room in the Capitol building. And there you go, a little story about a man named John. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Andrew Jackson. Born in the Carolinas on March 15, 1767, he would become the only president to pay off the national debt. At 13, he joined the militia as a courier during the Revolutionary War. He was captured by the British, where he contracted smallpox and nearly starved to death. By the age of 14, Andrew was the only surviving member of his family. Jackson served in Congress and helped shape the modern Democratic Party. He was also a lawyer, politician, farmer, and military commander. In 1794, he married Rachel Donaldson Robards. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected as the nation's seventh president. Sadly, his wife died 2 weeks after the election due to a heart attack. His claim to fame was his command of American forces to victory in the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson was also the first president to survive an assassination attempt. Today, many counties and cities bear his name, as well as a U.S. Army base and nuclear submarine. His face is also on the $20 bill. On June 8, 1845, Andrew Jackson died at his home in Tennessee at the age of 78. And there you go, a little story about a man named Andrew. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Martin Van Buren. Born in New York on December 5, 1782, he would become the first president not born of British descent, but Dutch. At 14 years old, he began his career studying law. At 24, he married his childhood sweetheart, Hannah Hose, and together raised 5 children. Sadly, after only 12 years of marriage, Hannah died of tuberculosis. Martin served as the governor of New York for only 2 months before he was appointed to President Andrew Jackson's cabinet. He also served as a U.S. Senator, Attorney General, Secretary of State, Vice President, and in 1837, he was elected as the nation's 8th president. Martin was the first president to be born an American citizen and the only one to speak English as a second language, as he grew up speaking Dutch. He was the 3rd president to serve 1 term, though he ran 2 more times, and first to sit down for an interview with a reporter. On July 24, 1862, Martin Van Buren died in his home in New York at the age of 79. And there you go, a little story about a man named Martin. Let me tell you a little story about a man named William Henry Harrison. Born on February 9, 1773, he would become the last president born as a British subject. In 1790, he began attending the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied medicine under Benjamin Rush. Following his father's death, William joined the Army at 18. At 22, he married Anna Symes and together raised 10 children. He found comfort in political life, where he came to fame as the man who led U.S. forces against the Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe. He served as a major general. congressman, senator, and governor. In 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected as the nation's 9th president, becoming the oldest president elected at 68 until Ronald Reagan 140 years later. On March 4, 1841, he delivered the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, 2 hours in the freezing rain. A month later, on April 4th, Harrison died of pneumonia, becoming the first president to die in office. It was also the shortest term ever served by a president. Following his death, William's widow was given $25,000 and the right to mail letters free of charge. Harrison's grandson, Benjamin Harrison, became America's 23rd president. And there you go, a little story about a man named William. Let me tell you a little story about a man named John Tyler. Born on March 29, 1790, he would become the first president to be born after the adoption of the Constitution. Raised within a successful family, Tyler received a great education and graduated from college at the age of 17. He served as a lawyer, congressman, senator, and governor. In 1840, he became the nation's 10th vice president, running alongside William Henry Harrison. After only 1 month in office, President Harrison died of pneumonia. On June 1, 1841, Congress declared John Tyler the 10th President of the United States, becoming the first Vice President to succeed the presidency. The incident eventually led to the creation of the 25th Amendment. Tyler's most significant accomplishment as president was the adoption of Texas into the Union. He was married twice and had 15 children. His first wife died in the White House. Soon after, he was married again, becoming the first president to be married while in office. John is also the first president to have a veto overridden by Congress and first to have impeachment proceedings brought against him following an unpopular veto. On January 18, 1862, John Tyler died in Richmond, Virginia at the age of 71. He is the only president in history not to be officially mourned in Washington due to his allegiance to the Confederacy. And there you go, a little story about a man named John. Let me tell you a little story about a man named James Polk. Born in North Carolina, November 2, 1795, scholars would call him one of the nation's greatest presidents. A bright student, he attended college at the University of North Carolina. During his 20s, James joined the militia, reaching the rank of colonel. He served as a lawyer, congressman, governor, and is the only president to have served as Speaker of the House. At 28, Polk married Sarah Childress, who became an active member in his campaigns and helped write speeches. In 1844, at the age of 49, James was elected as the nation's 11th president, becoming the youngest president till that time. While he promised to serve only 1 term in office, he accomplished much. Victory during the Mexican-American War and the creation of the Department of Interior. Polk also oversaw the launch of the U.S. Naval Academy, Smithsonian, Washington Monument, and the first postage stamp. On June 15, 1849, at the age of 53, James Polk died of cholera at his home in Nashville, Tennessee, just 3 months after leaving the White House. And there you go, a little story about a man named James. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Zachary Taylor. Born in Virginia on November 24, 1784, he was raised as a member of a very prominent family. In fact, his family tree consists of James Madison, Franklin Roosevelt, and Robert E. Lee. While he grew up on a farm, his schooling came from tutors, though he was reportedly a poor student. At 23, he joined the Army, where he rose in the ranks, thanks to his hard work and some family ties. 3 years later, he married Margaret Smith, and together raised 6 children. Known as Old Rough and Ready, Taylor served in the U.S. Army for 40 years, reaching the rank of Major General. His fame was compared to that of George Washington and Andrew Jackson after leading troops to victory in the Mexican-American War. Despite never having served in political office, in 1848, Zachary Taylor was elected as the nation's 12th president. Oddly, it was also his first time ever voting. He is known as the last president to hold slaves while in office and last Whig to win a presidential election. On July 9, 1850, Zachary Taylor died from the stomach flu at the age of 65. He was just 16 months into his presidential term, making it the 3rd shortest tenure in presidential history. And there you go, a little story about a man named Zachary. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Millard Fillmore. Born in New York State on January 7, 1800, he would become the first president born in the 19th century. Growing up, he apprenticed as a clothmaker and eventually found an appreciation for law. At 26, he married Abigail Powers and together raised 2 children. Millard's reputation as a smart and accomplished lawyer led him to own one of the most successful law firms in New York. During his years, he also served as an assemblyman and congressman. In 1848, Millard Fillmore was nominated as vice president, running alongside Zachary Taylor, who eventually won. On July 9, 1850, Fillmore became the 13th president of the United States, succeeding President Taylor, who died in office from a stomach condition. He became the last member of the Whig Party to serve as president. During his time in office, he famously passed the Compromise of 1850 and started the White House Library. Years earlier, he co-founded the University of Buffalo, where he served as chancellor, while at the same time serving as vice president and president. On March 8, 1874, Millard Fillmore died at the age of 74 after suffering a stroke. And there you go, a little story about a man named Millard. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Franklin Pierce. Born in a log cabin in New Hampshire on November 23, 1804, he would become the first president in history to affirm his oath of office on a law book rather than a Bible. As the son of a politician and governor, Franklin seemed destined for the political life. In 1826, he entered law school and eventually became a very successful lawyer. At the age of 27, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, becoming the youngest congressman at the time. He also served in the Senate. A likable man, he was nominated for governor of New Hampshire and U.S. Attorney General, but refused both. At 30 years old, he married Jane Means Appleton and together had 3 children. Sadly, all 3 died young. In 1852, Franklin Pierce was elected as the nation's 14th president. He became the only president to deliver an inaugural speech from memory and only president in history to have his original cabinet serve an entire term. A month after his inauguration, his vice president William King died, leaving him without a VP for 4 years. 12 years later, on October 8, 1869, President Franklin Pierce died of liver disease at the age of 64. And there you go, a little story about a man named Franklin. Let me tell you a little story about a man named James Buchanan. Born in Pennsylvania on April 23, 1791, he would become the only president in history to never marry. The second of 11 children, it was certainly easy for James to get lost in the family name. Determined to stand out, he attended law school where he became one of Pennsylvania's best attorneys. Following a successful law career, Buchanan served in the House of Representatives, Senate, and as Secretary of State under President James Polk. In fact, no Secretary of State has been president since. He was even given a Supreme Court nomination but declined. In 1856, James Buchanan became the nation's 15th president. Buchanan operated under the constitutional belief that the U.S. Constitution was the highest authority in our country. This lost him a lot of support when a decision needed to be made about slaves in the South, as the Constitution originally made room for slavery. Historians say his failure to deal with the attempted secession of states before the Civil War is the worst presidential mistake in history. On June 1, 1868, James Buchanan died in Pennsylvania at the age of 77. And there you go, a little story about a man named James. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Abraham Lincoln. Born on February 12, 1809, he and Lyndon Johnson would eventually be known as the tallest presidents in history, standing 6'4". Raised in a one-room log cabin, he was mostly self-educated. A lover of books, Lincoln served as a lawyer, state legislator, and congressman. In 1842, he married Mary Todd and together raised 4 boys. Sadly, only one lived past 18. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected to the first of 2 terms as the nation's 16th president and one of the most controversial, becoming the first Republican to hold the office. As president, he welcomed 2 more states into the Union, led the country through the Civil War, and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He also delivered the Gettysburg Address, one of the most famous speeches in history. On April 15, 1865, 6 days after the surrender of the Confederate Army, Abe was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth during a play at at Ford's Theater. 10 days later, Booth was found and killed by authorities. Lincoln was the first president to be assassinated and was buried in Springfield, Illinois. Today, Lincoln's image can be seen on the penny, $5 bill, and Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And there you go, a little story about a man named Abe. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Andrew Johnson. Born in Raleigh, North Carolina on December 29, 1808, Andrew grew up in poverty. With no formal education, he taught himself how to read and write. At 18, he married 16-year-old Eliza McCardle and together raised 5 children. Andrew's wife continued his education, teaching him algebra and improved reading and writing skills. He later served in the U.S. House of Representatives, Senate, and as governor of Tennessee. In 1864, Andrew replaced Hannibal Hamlin on the re-election ticket for President Abraham Lincoln, which they won. A year later, Lincoln was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater. The next day, Andrew Johnson was sworn in as the nation's 17th president, becoming the first VP to succeed the presidency following an assassination. However, his attempt to fire one of his cabinet members led him to become the first president to be impeached. He narrowly escaped a guilty verdict by the Senate. In 1875, following his presidency, Andrew Johnson was once again elected to the U.S. Senate, making him the only former president to do so. However, a few months later, on July 31st, he died of a stroke at the age of 66. And there you go, a little story about a man named Andrew. Let me tell you a little story about a man named Hiram Ulysses Grant. Born in Point Pleasant, Ohio on April 27, 1822, he would become the first president elected after the abolishment of slavery. At 17, he entered West Point Military Academy, thanks to the nomination of an area congressman who mistakenly put his name down as Ulysses S. Grant, which he kept, eventually earning him the nickname Uncle Sam. At 26, he married Julia Boggs Dent and together raised 4 children. As a soldier, Grant served under future President Zachary Taylor in the Mexican-American War, where he learned the methods of his commanders on the battlefield. He would eventually become a revered general for the Union Army during the Civil War, where he used his knowledge of combat to defeat the Confederate Army. This led to his enormous popularity, and in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected as the nation's 18th president. 4 years later, he was re-elected, making him the first president to serve 2 full terms in 40 years. While he was known as a strong advocate for civil rights, his office was plagued by numerous scandals and bribery, which is ironic, seeing how his face marks the $50 bill. On July 23, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant died of throat cancer at the age of 63. And there you go, a little story about a man named Ulysses.
Thanks for joining us for this special President's Day presentation of the New American TV. We encourage you to follow us at thenewamerican.com. And we'll see you tomorrow. Happy President's Day and God bless America.